Welcome back to the Make Space Boring Show. I am your host, Jason Canigan, the founder of this thing called Star Technologies. And I am here once again with the great Raphael Roettgen, founder of E2MC, which is one of the great venture capitalist firms for the space industry. And we're here to talk about what happened in October for funding rounds. Raphael is published on spacewatch.global, and I'll link to the article in the description below. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, sure, Jason. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure. So October, the good news is funding continued, a little bit slower than some of the other months, but still somewhere north of $100 million in total. We didn't have any sort of real blockbuster triple-digit $1 million rounds in October. The biggest one was Astroscale, so another big round out of Japan. Astroscale, obviously a space debris cleanup company, and they collected $51 million. Basically from Japanese investors. So that's replicating a pattern we've seen multiple times now, that Japanese space startups are able to raise significant sums of money from Japanese investors. This is only a couple of months or so from memory after iSpace, another prominent Japanese company, obviously focused on the moon, on lunar activities with landers and lunar transport, raised also a very significant round. Further than that, some smaller rounds, for example, D-Orbit. So this is again an orbit services company out of Italy. They raised some money. Interesting here, they raised it directly from the European Investment Bank. I think we'll see more and more of that in the future. That's a declared goal of the European Investment Bank and / European Investment Fund to directly support startups in certain frontier technology sectors, specifically including space. D-Orbit also had a successful operational milestone very recently, where basically they helped deploy some satellites in various orbits. So both on the operational and financial front, this is going well. Some other minor rounds which you can see here on the list, but probably most people would agree that one of the most interesting news with regard to space financing in October was the announcement of Momentous Space. So this is a Californian company that's basically, well, for the moment developing a space tug, right, or space tugs, I should say. And they announced that they intend to list the company via merging with a so-called SPAC, a special purpose acquisition vehicle. So we've obviously already had something like this in the space sector last year, actually pretty much a year ago. It was end of October last year when Virgin Galactic, the space tourism company, merged with Social Capital, another SPAC, and thereby listed on the stock exchange. So this would be sort of the second big one of a pure space company, and it obviously triggered all sorts of speculations whether we might see more and more of that, as there is a number of SPACs out there. Basically, these companies, again, that SPAC stands for Special Purpose Acquisition Vehicles, or Special Purpose Acquisition Companies, I should say, hence SPAC. And they're basically these empty companies or empty of operational assets, but full of cash, looking to acquire or merge with something that would then be listed. So people are, speculating who might be next. Whether there's obviously already a number of larger space startups out there who could potentially qualify, and we shall see. Now, I don't want to comment too specifically on this transaction, but the valuation is, let's say, quite interesting. Certainly assumes that the company will do a lot of things work out well for the company. If they do, then then it may look attractive. But there's certainly it's a relatively young company, and you need to look a few years out in the future and assume things go well. And we should certainly keep our fingers crossed, because the last thing we want to see for the space sector is something like this blowing up into investors' faces, sort of turning off nascent broader investor interest in the sector. The other thing which I mentioned in the update is that, so my updates typically focus on the private financing rounds. Obviously, there is obviously the whole public side, the money that's given out by space agencies like NASA and ESA and so forth, and or other public entities, including the whole the military side of things, the intelligence community. And so we did have $370 million announced of what's called the NASA Tipping Point program for 14 US companies. So that's obviously quite positive. We are obviously recording this just a few days after the US election. And so, one big question, I think, on everybody's mind with regard to public financing. And I hope, Jason, you're going to do at least one, maybe multiple episodes on this with good guesses what might happen under what looks to be the new administration now. Because I don't think too many people have any idea what might happen. Obviously, it will impact that public funding side.
Well, I'm always happy to guess and be wrong. So that's a distinct possibility that I might poke my head up and say, here's what I think will happen. But yeah, I was dismayed to see that the NASA administrators thinking about leaving, and that climate change might become more important to NASA than going back to the moon. I think that's
yeah.
a
I don't think
disturbing
anybody
change
is
in policy.
surprised that Jim Bridenstine is leaving. At the end of the day, it's a political appointment. On the other hand, I think he was a person who really endeared himself to both sides of the aisle. So I think a lot of us are sad that he's probably leaving.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he pops up next. We saw Dr. Fred Kennedy move out of a civilian organization, a military organization appointment, go to a private launch company, and then suddenly appear at Momentous right before the the big funding round, right? And as soon as he showed up there, I went, oh, that's interesting, because you've got Dr. Joel Sercel and Dr. Fred Kennedy on the same team now, and something real is happening there. And then suddenly the money showed up, so that was nice. If folks want to find out more about that, I've interviewed Dr. Joel Sercel on the show, and also you mentioned Astroscale early on. Charity Whedon was on, I think they're vice president of policy, and I think legal, but policy for sure. And that was an educational episode, part of the space situational awareness playlist that we have on the Cold Star Project for that kind of issue. So Raphael, what do you think is coming? Do you think that investment is going to continue over the next few months, or are we looking towards another scary US lockdown and funding drying up again?
Well, I think actually, we've had this sort of noticeable dip around April, May, right, when people were trying to figure out what was going on, and let's say I was going to say the fog of war, let's call it the fog of COVID, was sort of at its maximum, and like in terms of lack of visibility. I think we're kind of hopefully through this, and we're also recording this today, November 9th, and you probably have seen there's just been news out that Pfizer's vaccine seems to work very well. So I guess keeping that in mind, there's certainly reason to be optimistic now, looking forward. Right. Again, with the sort of hope proviso that, at least in the US, if not globally, we have to kind of now keep an eye on what's happening on the public policy side.
Okay, so there may be a way out. That's good, rather than having to go back to a shutdown, lockdown. Well, excellent. Well, thank you for doing this, Raphael. If folks want to find out more about you, they can go to the E2MC.com website, which is a fantastic website. It's one of the nicest design ones that I've seen, very informative. And also connect with Raphael on YouTube. Yes, also. Oh, we should mention your own podcast there. Name your podcast and where people can hear about it.
Sure, my podcast is the Space Business Podcast. It comes out every 2 weeks. I mostly interview space entrepreneurs, although every few episodes I get a little bit bored with business myself and I try to interview somebody else from the space community. So actually the latest episode that's out is with Dr. Graham Lau, who's an astrobiologist. And it's a fantastic episode, and I recommend everybody listen to it. You can find it on every major platform, so that's Apple, Google, Spotify, and so forth. And if I may bring in another plug here, if you happen to speak German, I have just published an introductory book on new space business, German language for now only, unfortunately, but you can also find that on my LinkedIn page, or if you look for it on Amazon.
Excellent. Well, that needs to get translated into English ASAP so that I can read it. I've been studying German for 4 years, but I'm not that competent.
Sure.
Thanks for doing that, Raphael. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.